Hello and welcome to another tutorial by Harpy Cloud Solutions. Today we'll be looking at configuring private access to Azure Virtual Desktop. So an Azure Virtual Desktop is basically a desktop and app virtualization service that runs on the cloud. It can be used to set up multi session and even single session for your environment at work. If you need your team members to access a particular set of instances at the same time that serve the same purpose, you can basically use an Azure Virtual Desktop. An alternative for this is something called a Citrix Server Farm, and this is outside the solution provided by Microsoft Azure. So today we'll be looking at and implementing this architecture. So the architecture you're seeing right here is basically a high level diagram that shows how the private link securely connects a local client to the Azure Virtual Desktop service. In this tutorial, we will be creating a VNet, Subnet, and an NSG, that's a network security group. We'll be creating an Azure Virtual Desktop. We'll disable public access to host pool. We'll create private endpoints. We'll disable public access to workspace and create a VM in our internal network and a Bastion host to text access. So basically, since the connection is going to be blocked from public access, we want to create a VM in the internal network of the private endpoint and then create a bastion host which will now enable us to be in that same network, and then we'll be able to access the AVD privately. If you have a virtual private network, that's a VPN, already set up in your office, then you don't need a bastion host. You can just set up a route which ensures that every traffic that flows from a particular range of IPs has to pass through your private endpoint subnet, and we'll see that. So now we are in the Azure portal, and the first thing we're going to do here is to enable a feature called the Azure Virtual Desktop Private Link. In case you don't have this done already, you go to your Azure subscription, you go to your preview features. Currently, this is no more in preview, but you can find this here. Type private and click on search and just wait for it to load. It's going to bring out a list of features. This feature was released in 2021, so it is not private. You can use it in your production environment. All right, so this is the feature I'm talking about, which is the Azure Virtual Desktop Private Link. So right now I have it registered, but if you do not have it registered in your environment, all you have to do is to click here, register, and that will do it. Now, the next thing we'll be doing is to create a virtual network that we're going to use for this service. So I would go to virtual networks and I'll create one. All right, I will put it in a resource group called AVD resource group, and my virtual network will be AVD VNet. Yes, you guessed right. So next, enable Azure Bastion. I won't do that now. Next, and so what I'm going to do is I'm going to delete this subnet because this is not the IP range I want to use. I'm going to use 172.21.0.0/16. I'm going to create two subnets. The first one will be the AVD subnet, and I'll call it AVD subnet. And this will use 172.21.2. And I'll add this. And then I'm going to create another one. And this is the private endpoint subnet. So the private endpoint and the virtual machines itself are going to sit on different subnets. So now I'll put this on 21.3 and add. So now that we've done that, the next is to review and create. Create. And now we wait. So the AVD VNet has created successfully, and as you can see here, the two subnet which we created, the AVD subnet and P subnet, have also been created. So now the next thing we'll be looking at is to create the virtual desktop. So basically type virtual desktop up there and go to virtual desktop. So right now we're going to create a host pool. Resource group remains the same. Host pool, I'll just give it a name. And for my region, Australia is desktop pool type. I'm going to say pool because it's going to be multiple people using it. For breadth first, I'm going to choose depth. For load balancing algorithm, I'm going to choose depth first. Depth first means that if I say maximum of users are 2, then that means for X number of instances. So let me say if the number of instances in my session host is 3, so that means when the first instance is a capacity of 2 people, it will take the third person to the second instance. So when the second instance is marked at 2, it's going to take the fifth person to the next instance. So that's how it is. Next is creation of virtual machines. I'm going to select yes. So the prefix would be AVD VM, and still Australia is no infrastructure because this is just a demo and not for production. Standard. So for image, I'm going to select Windows 10 Enterprise Multi-Session. Right, and I'll just reduce the size to something small since this is just for a demo. And I'll choose this. Next, I'm going to say I just want 2 VMs. For OS disk type, HDD, leave that as it is. We created AVD VNet earlier, so I'll select that. And I'm going to use the AVD subnet, okay? So now the next is to select, the Entra type. So I'm going to select Microsoft Entra ID. For enrollment with Intune, if you select yes, then you can enroll your VM with Intune. For this, I'm just going to leave it as no because I don't want to enroll it with Intune at the moment. Username, just give it the username. So this is the username that you use to log into the instances. Right. Next, workspaces. Leave that as it is. Leave that as it is. Review plus create. Validation passed. So I'm just gonna click create. So this is gonna take some time to create because it's creating different resources at once. So I'm just gonna pause here and come back when we're done creating this. Azure Virtual Desktop has been created successfully, and we can see the host pool that was created with it. So there's the host pool here, and if you click on it, you see 2 virtual machines are connected. And then there's also the application group that's also created with it. Something else that we need to create, which was not created earlier, and which you can actually create during the initial AVD creation, is the workspace. So right now, I'm just going to click on Create Workspace and select the same resource group, and I'll just give this a name and friendly name. I'll also just say AVD Workspace. So location Australia is always Australia is, and you have to attach an application group. So the application group we have in this is the one we just created right now. So I'm just gonna click add and then select. So now the next thing, enable diagnostics. Here I'll just click review plus create. And now the validation is passed. I will click create. All right, so we're basically going to wait for this to create. It shouldn't take much of time. Yes, so now we've created the workspace. So if you go to the workspace, we see here, later we're going to come back here. This is one of the places where we're going to create a private endpoint connection for. But before that, let's go to the AVD subnet. So if I go to the VNet and then I go to the subnet, you see this AVD subnet here. I'm going to create a network security group and attach it to this subnet because this is where the VMs are sitting. And what I'm going to do is that I'm going to disable all internet outbound access. So network security groups, click on create, and AVD name, AVD NSG, and next review plus create. So this is basically going to create a network security group. So this shouldn't take time. Yes, it's created. Going to the network security group, we see that for the outbound rules, we have to allow VNet outbound rule. So what I'm going to do now is I'm going to add another rule, and I would say destination service tag, and this I will set it to virtual desktop, and I would choose HTTPS for this, and then it's going to be deny. I'll give this 310 and add. So now I've created a rule to prevent outbound access to the virtual desktop. The next thing is I'm going to associate this NSG to a subnet. So I'll go to subnet, click on associate, and it's going to be associated with AVD subnet. Click on OK, and that has been saved. So now that is done, let's go back to the Azure Virtual Desktop. So now we can see that it is still showing that it's connected to the virtual machines. What I'm going to do right now is to restart the VM so that the change that we put in will kick in. So now if I go to virtual machines, you can see that we created two VMs. And these two VMs they now have the network security group associated with it. Okay. So if you look at the outbound rules, you'd see the one that we just set right now. So firstly, I'm going to restart this VM, and then I'll also restart the second one. All right. It's still restarting. So I'll just wait for that to be done restarting, and we will continue our configuration. So when that is done restarting, the next thing that we're going to do is to go into the Azure Virtual Desktop, and then we go to the host pools, select this host pool, refresh. The VM is still restarting. So while it's doing that, all we're going to do right now is to disable public access and use private access. And then I'll just click save here. All right. So I'll just click save here so we can see disable public access, use private access. Now the next thing is to to create a private endpoint. Still in the same resource group, we'll give it AVD private endpoint. Then region remains Australia East, resource connection, virtual network. Here we're going to use the AVD VNet we created, but then we're going to select the PE subnet. Remember I said this is going to be used for the private endpoint. And then I'll leave this as it is. Go to DNS. I'm going to use this, and then next to tags, I'm just going to leave that like that. Validation passed, and then I'm going to create. So I'm just going to wait for this to be done creating, and then I will come back when it's done. So the private endpoint which I created for the host pool created successfully. And what I went to do is to also create a private endpoint for the workspaces, and I'll show you that. So just to save time, so if I go to the Azure Virtual Desktop, you see that in the host pool, if you click networking, we now have, first of all, public access disabled, and we have a private endpoint that has been created here. And we can also see that there's a connection being established here. This connection is not going through the public internet, but it's going through the private link, because if you saw that earlier on, that I disabled outbound access or outbound traffic to the Azure Virtual Desktop. So right now we would look at the workspaces. What I did is to was to also disable public access here, and then I created a private endpoint also for this. So if I click on the private endpoint I created, you see that the target sub resource that this was created for is feed. Okay. And when you're creating this, private link solution, you have to create two private endpoints for a workspace. You have to create one for feed and you have to create one for global. So now I've created one for feed and I'm going to create one for global. So I'll say AVD workspace PE global, and region still remains Australia East. Next. So the target resource I've created for feed, so now I'll create for global. Virtual network. P subnet remains the same. DNS, leave it as it is. Next tags, review plus create, and then create. So now we're just gonna wait for this to be done creating. And after the creation is done, we have successfully now deployed our architecture where every traffic to AVD has to go through the private link. It has to go through private network, because from all you've seen right now, you've seen that we've disabled public access and only said that private access should be used. Once this is done creating, all we're going to be looking at is, you know, going to the virtual machine and creating another virtual machine. The reason I'm creating this virtual machine is because I currently do not have a VPN set up. If you have a VPN set up, you can basically just set up a site-to-site VPN that, that communicates with your PE subnet. So the PE subnet is where your private endpoint sits. So right now, I'm going to create a VM sitting in the PE subnet, and it's going to have only private access. And then I'll also create a Bastion host, which enables me to access that VM in the internal network. All right. So let's do this. I'll wait for this to be done creating, and then we would come back and continue to create the VM. All right. So we are getting there. Right now, we've created the last private endpoint which we're going to create today, which is the private endpoint for global. So we've created three endpoints now. We've created the first one for the host pool, we created one for feed, and then we created one for global. So right now, I'll go back to Azure Virtual Desktop. Something that we shouldn't forget, and it's very important, is to add your users and group to the application pool. So basically, your users and group are the people that are going to have access to the workspace that you create. So in this case, I'm just going to add myself as a user, and I'm going to look for Harpy Cloud Solutions. And let's go with this, select, and then I'll sign in, because it's important. Everybody that needs to access it has to be added in the assignment section. All right. With that done, the next thing that we're going to do is to create a virtual machine. And like I said, the virtual machine is going to sit in the same network with the PE subnet. I'm doing this because I do not have a sorry, I'm doing this because I do not have a um virtual private network, that's a VPN setup. So if you do have a VPN setup, all you have to do is to, you know, add that PE subnet route to your firewall, and then you will now create a route on Azure to say let all traffic go through your PE subnet. All right. So I'm gonna create VM PE. What name should I give it for AVD? Right. Yeah, that's a funny name, but you get the point. Alright, we go to standard. I'll just give it a 2019, doesn't really matter. I'll give it this because it doesn't really matter. Um, okay, I'm gonna leave RDP because I'm gonna go in anyways. HDD, leave this as it is. Next, networking. Like I said, we're gonna use the PE subnet. Just what we're going to use. We don't need a private IP because we're going to use a Bastion host to get into this. We don't need a public IP, sorry. So I'm going to remove this public IP. We are only going to use the private IP because remember, we want only private access. We want it to be in an internal network. So no public IP. All right. So with that said, I'm going to keep this. Next, management. Leave it as it is. I don't need this right now. I'm just gonna disable it and then review plus create and create. All right, we are almost there. So right now, when my VM is done creating, I'm going to enable Bastion on the VM and then I can access the VM. Something else to note is for Azure Virtual Desktop, there is a general default URL to access it, and this is it. So right now, let me go to this link and let's see what it tells me. Okay, I need to do my authentication. Yes, just to stay safe. All right, it's done. Okay, so now it's taking me to that AVD workspace which I created, but it's saying failed to get resources for AVD workspace. Access is forbidden. Yay! So now we've been able to see that public access is not allowed. So right now, when we're done creating the VM and we've created a bastion, and then we are in the same private network with the PE subnet, then we will try this again, and then it should work because it is not a public access. All right, the VM is created. Let's go to the resource. Next, I'm going to create a bastion. Let's do this. Deploy bastion. So I'm going to wait for the bastion host to be deployed successfully. And we will come back shortly. So right now we are almost about to be done. The Bastion host has been done creating, and I'm just going to log in using the credentials that I used to create the VM and then connect. So now what this is doing is it's going to connect me into the VM, which is the VM-PE for VD, for AVD. That's the one I created to enable me be in the same private and internal network as the PE subnet. So once this is done loading, we will then try this exact URL that failed in the public network. We're going to try it inside this internal network when the server has loaded up. So now we just wait. In the meantime, I'll just copy this URL and wait for the VM to load up. All right, so the server is up and running now, and I will just go to the Edge browser And in the Edge browser, what I've done is to input the URL that I copied, which is this one, and I click on enter. It's going to require me to sign in with my credentials. So I'm just going to get the credentials to sign in with. Just hold up. And I'll just use myself. And I'll get these credentials. Go back. Right. Alright, so I'm in now. Moment of truth. And voila, we can see that the session host is visible for us who are in the internal network. But if you go outside the internal network, that's the public IP, public access, you won't be able to see the workspace. You won't be able to see any of the session host. So like you saw here, it's going to show you access is forbidden from this network. But when you do it inside the internal network, whether you're on a VPN, whatever network that you have, you know, configured to allow access through your PE subnet, then you'll be able to access your session host. So now all you have to do is to click it, go into the session host, log into the session host with the credentials that you use to create the VMs, and that should work. So basically, the points that we try to prove here is to show that you can actually configure private access to your Azure Virtual Desktop and protect it from malicious users. So I hope you were able to get a thing or two and also implement this into your environment. You can leave a comment below if you have any questions, and I'll be ready to answer them. Thank you. If you want to see more of these videos, you can subscribe to Happy Cloud Solutions YouTube channel. And also, if you want to learn more about Azure or you have a project that you need assistance with, Happy Cloud Solution is always available and more than ready to help you. Just reach out to us at www.happycloudsolutions.com, and you can always contact us through the forms that are made available on the website. Thank you. See you later.